During the month of May and into the first week of June, my husband, age 82, fell 11 times. His legs, once strong enough to thru-hike the Appalachian Trail at the age of 60, now turned to wet spaghetti in an instant. In all of those falls or collapses, he got bruised. His skin is so thin now, it doesn't take much. In one fall, he cut his head and his arm. In another, he could have died. Alzheimer's degrades a person slowly over years, or the downturn can escalate suddenly. You need to know what that downturn could look like and why you might question what you're seeing. The falls and the downturn. That's what this episode, number 8, is all about. You're listening to My Spouse Has Dementia, a podcast that uses personal stories, occasional interviews, and simple rituals to support dementia caregiving spouses. My goal is to help us survive, because about 40% of us die first. I'm Zita Christian, writer, life cycle celebrant, and caregiver. My husband has Alzheimer's, late stage. On May 6th, the week before the first fall, Dick experienced another first. I was at the Cox Public Access Television studio trying to learn how to edit a 2-camera shoot for Page One, a show about writing that I have on public access and on YouTube. Pamela, the CNA who helps me 2 mornings a week, was caring for Dick. As soon as I walked back into the house, I smelled bleach. And I knew. I just knew what had happened. Pamela stood there with paper towels in her hand. She said Dick had been sitting in his recliner. He stood up suddenly, dropped his pants, and defecated. The first fall came 6 days later, on May 12th. It was around 9 p.m. Dick had been asleep for a few hours. I heard him stirring, so I walked in to check on him. He was walking towards the bathroom, and he seemed fine. Halfway across the room, though, he suddenly swayed and just toppled forward, flat on his face on the hardwood floor. He bruised his nose, his cheek, he cut his head, he cut his arm. Both cuts drew blood, but they were minor. Now, I keep first aid items in easy reach in both the kitchen and in our bathroom, so I grabbed what I needed and I cleaned the cuts. I applied some antibiotic ointment and a couple good-sized Band-Aids, and the bleeding stopped right away. Then came the challenge of getting him up off the floor. I'm 5 feet tall. I can't lift him on my own, not even with a lift belt, which I have right next to the bed. So I pulled out my cell phone from my pocket to call my neighbors, Mark and Angel, and realized that I didn't have their numbers. I raced down the stairs out the front door and to their unit 2 doors down. They came in a flash. Angel is from Puerto Rico, and his medium height, slender build, olive skin tones, they're very similar to that of Dick's younger brother, Albie, when the brothers were in their 20s. Angel's smile is open and friendly. His energy is very engaging, just like Albie's was. Albie died about 20 years ago. I think that when Dick sees Angel, he sees Albie. So when Angel walked into our bedroom and saw Dick on the floor, he gave him a big smile and said, "Hey, my friend, don't worry, we're here to help you." And a few minutes later, Angel and Mark got Dick up and back into bed. 6 days later, on May 18th, Dick opened the glass door of our big grandfather clock and yanked off one of the 3 big heavy weights. I have since locked that glass door, and it brings to mind that old adage about the horse and the barn. That night, he fell again. That's fall number 2. It was more of a drop, or what they call a collapse, but it still counts as a fall. His legs just turned to cooked spaghetti. He didn't hit anything, and I waited about 10 minutes for the feeling in his legs to return, because that's usually what happens. But this time the feeling didn't come back. And over these last few years, I've learned that it's really dangerous for an elderly person to lie on the floor. Something about blood pooling. I don't remember all the details. I just knew that I had to get my husband up. Mark and Angel weren't home, so I called the police dispatch desk. And no, that's not 911. The dispatch desk is the number that the police told me to call if I ever needed what is called a lift assist. So a few minutes later, a fire truck pulled up in front of my door. 3 EMTs came in. They went upstairs, and you see, when Dick collapsed that time, he got wedged, best way to describe it, between the bed and the hope chest. I couldn't get him to roll over on his side or brace himself against the bed, some of the movements that have worked in the past, but the EMTs did get him up. 3 days later, on May 21st, Dick fell again. Another collapse. This was number 3. I was in the kitchen with my contractor, Mike, and we were talking about some much-needed repairs and a project that I've had on the back burner for several years. I wanted a little podcast studio in the basement, a space treated for sound, a space where I could safely set up equipment and not worry that Dick would bump into it. Dick walked in and he stood next to me by the sink, and suddenly his legs turned to spaghetti. He just collapsed against me. I braced myself against the counter, and Mike jumped up from his chair and he grabbed it and then positioned it right behind Dick so that he could sit down safely. Getting Dick to sit down, just that in itself took a while. It always does. Eventually, though, things calmed down and there were no injuries. Fall number 4 came the next day, Sunday, May 22nd. I was upstairs in my office, the room next to our bedroom. It was late afternoon, 4:10 to be exact. I'd been taking a class on Zoom, and Dick was downstairs asleep in his recliner. But you see, I had been wearing headphones. I never heard the cluster of sleigh bells that I have hanging on the front door. That's my makeshift alarm system to alert me if Dick opens the door to go outside. So I headed downstairs, and halfway down I could see that the front door was unlocked. My heart lurched. As I rushed outside, I just, slapped my hand against the pocket of my pants just to make sure I had my phone. And there he was, in the center island of our condominium complex. He was sitting on a wooden pallet that belongs to the construction company that they're here replacing the crumbling foundations of our 6 buildings. On the ground next to the pallet were several steel beams covered with a big tarp. Dick had taken off his shoes and his socks, and he was pulling the tarp up over his head as though setting up a tent. You can imagine how relieved I was to see that he wasn't hurt, but that didn't last long. He didn't want to leave the tent. He didn't want to put his shoes back on. It took more than a few minutes to convince him that he wasn't on the Appalachian Trail and that we had to go home. Eventually, he did stand up, and arm in arm, we walked a few yards, and then suddenly, yeah, you guessed it, his legs just turned to spaghetti. I faced him and scooped my arms under his so that I could break his fall and keep him from hitting his head, but he still went down right on the driveway that leads into the dumpster. There was nothing for either of us to brace against, and I wasn't comfortable letting him lay there until the sensation in his legs returned, because I never know how long that's going to take. Someone walking to the dumpster wouldn't pose a problem, but someone driving a car into that dumpster driveway, well, they wouldn't expect to see a body on the road. I looked around. Now, there aren't very many people living here right now because only 2 of the 6 buildings have been repaired. The other 4 buildings are still up in the air. The owners are living elsewhere, and I could see that Mark and Angel in my building I could see their driveway and it was empty, so I knew that they weren't home. I took out my phone and I called police dispatch and said I needed a lift assist. I explained where we were, outside on the ground. So a fire truck and 3 EMTs, they were there in just a few minutes, and they got Dick to his feet, but he was still very wobbly. Right about that time, my next-door neighbor, Carol, appeared, and she came over and she talked to Dick like a familiar voice while I ran back home for the walker. Now, this walker is the kind that has a nice, cushy, padded seat. And the EMTs convinced Dick to sit down on the walker, and then they pulled it, got him home, got him into the building and into his recliner. They asked if I wanted Dick to go to the ER, and I did not. I knew that he had not landed hard and that he had definitely not hit his head, so I declined. The next day, though, I ordered a lightweight folding transport chair. Think of it like it's a wheelchair, but without the big wheels on the side. The transport chair is made really for the person who is pushing the chair, not the person sitting in the chair. The next day, May 24th, he collapsed again. This time we were both in the living room, and this time he melted between 2 chairs. I helped him turn so that he could brace against one of the chairs, and a few minutes later he was strong enough to kneel, and then he pulled himself up. That was fall number 5. Over the next few days, my husband slept a lot. One day, 12 hours. The next day, 15 hours. The third day, 22 hours. Fall number 6 came exactly 1 week later on May 31st. For the last few months, he'd been suffering on and off with constipation, and that's not uncommon with Alzheimer's. And you see, in the same way that the disease makes his legs forget how to walk, it makes his bowels forget how to move. Unlike with the other bouts of constipation, though, this time Dick was in pain. I'd been giving him laxatives and stool softeners. I mixed powdered fiber in his juice. I gave him oatmeal, and I made pancakes with coconut milk, but nothing worked. That morning, I thought a nice hot shower would relax his muscles and his body might remember what to do. We have just an old-fashioned shower in a tub, not a freestanding. We have grip bars on the wall of the shower and on the side of the tub. He got into the tub just fine, and he got out just fine. He was standing on a rug, a little throw rug next to the tub, drying off, when I just turned around to get the clean clothes that I had placed on the bed, which was just a few feet away. And in those moments, spaghetti legs. Everything happened so fast, beginning with the look of terror in his eyes. I rushed over, I grabbed him under the arms, and I kept him from hitting his head against anything, but he went down. I covered him with a blanket and I put a pillow under his head. And now he's lying on a cold tile floor, and that increased the danger of blood pooling. So for the 3rd time that month, I called for a lift assist. The fire truck pulled up. The EMTs came upstairs, and again they got Dick up and safely back to bed. Did I want him to go to the hospital? No, I said no. But then one of the EMTs pointed out that if my husband went to the hospital, they could give him an enema to relieve the pain of the constipation and check to see if there was a blockage of any kind in his intestines. So, of course, yes, I said, absolutely, please take him and let's go. They called for an ambulance and it came right away. The crew carried Dick down the stairs in one of those special chairs. I was ready to grab my purse and follow behind the car, and that's when I got some valuable advice. And if you remember nothing from this episode, remember these 2 things. If you're in a situation like this, number 1, you need to make a phone call. The EMT told me to go back inside, take a few minutes to breathe, and then call the neurologist who was treating Dick. Tell the office what happened. They know that I have Dick's power of attorney. Someone in the neurologist's office will call the emergency room to say that Dick is their patient. The EMT then assured me that taking this one simple step would really help move things along at the ER. And number 2, have your information for your loved one in one place. Now, I'm usually a pretty calm person. Still, it's easy to get rattled when someone you love is in pain. In my office, I have a color printer that can also be used as a copier. And a couple weeks earlier, I had made a color copy all on one side of a sheet of my husband's photo ID, his insurance cards, front and back, and COVID vaccination card. And then I added his list of meds plus my contact info. I had collected all of this information as a matter of record keeping, updating it as was needed. Now I saw its real value. My husband wouldn't be able to answer any questions once they got to the ER, but the info on that one sheet would save folks at the ER a whole lot of time and frustration. So I gave a copy to one of the EMTs, and they put my husband in the ambulance. For several weeks now, I'd been talking with Amanda. She's the social worker at the neurologist's office about palliative care for my husband. That phone call that I made to the neurologist's office, that was to Amanda. I had her direct number, and I got her voicemail. My heart just sank. But in the few minutes that it took me to gather my thoughts, she texted me. She had already called the ER, confirmed that Dick was a patient of the neurology office, and left instructions that when he was released, it should be to the palliative care team of the Visiting Nurses Association. I felt so much better. I grabbed my purse, got my keys, and I drove down to the ER. The waiting room was full, but I didn't see my husband. So I walked up to one of the 3 registration windows. I gave them my name and said my husband had been brought in by ambulance. All I had to do was check a form and slap on a visitor's pass, and in barely a minute, I was ushered into the treatment area. Dick was lying on a bed just outside one of the rooms because all the rooms were full, and we were definitely relieved to see each other. About an hour or so later, Dick told me that he had to urinate. One of the nurses helped him off the bed and into a nearby restroom. A few moments later, the nurse called for assistance, and another nurse went, and then they called for housekeeping. Dick's bowels finally remembered what to do. 6 days of constipation, all over the bathroom floor. X-rays came next. The ER doctor wanted to see if Dick had a blockage of some kind. The X-rays proved negative, but the process of getting them was pure frustration. There were, I think, 5 techs in the room, most of them fairly young. I don't know how many dementia patients they had X-rayed before, but as you and I know, you can't say to a person with late-stage Alzheimer's, "Deep breath, stand still, don't move." Later, back in the emergency room bed, Dick fought with the nurse who had to draw blood, and in a stern voice that I had never heard from him, he said, "You're a bad girl." He got really angry with the nurse who had to take his blood pressure, and I felt sorry for her. I felt sorry for my husband, too. He had so many bruises, there was no pain-free area to place the cuff. Adding to the challenges of the day, Dick kept trying to get out of bed. And finally, the nurse tilted the bed so that Dick's head was lower than his body. That didn't stop him. He pulled himself up, swung his legs over the railing, and he might have gotten out if it hadn't been for this orderly. And this orderly, he's like a mountain of muscles. And he just calmly walked over. He scooped Dick up in his arms like he was a toddler, and he said, "Stay in the bed." And with that, he laid Dick back down. We were there a little over 4 hours when a nurse came over to say that the blood work and the x-rays were clear, and obviously Dick wasn't constipated anymore, so we could go home. The next day we had our first visit with the nurse from the Visiting Nurses Association. Her name is Erin. We talked for about 90 minutes while she observed Dick, checked his vital signs, measured his right calf and his upper portion of his right arm, and she checked for broken skin. Then we talked about end-of-life documents. I showed her the originals, including Dick's medical directive and the document that gives me Dick's power of attorney. She scanned the documents into her computer. We talked about the DNR and DNI orders, do not resuscitate, do not intubate. Years ago, when Dick understood what was going on, he and I had met with our attorney to have that same conversation. We had both agreed that should we ever wind up in a situation like Dick is in now, where there's no hope for recovery, and then, have a heart attack or some other event that renders us so incapacitated, or our health degrades to where we're unable to eat, we wouldn't want to be resuscitated or intubated. And now, sitting in the living room with Erin, the hypothetical took a giant leap closer to reality. I affirmed the earlier decision. Erin said she feels the best way she can help her families is to be straight with them, and I agreed. I didn't tell her that until Alzheimer's took hold, Dick always called me straight shooter, or straight for short. He also called me his best girl, and he did that, a couple months ago too. So anyway, Erin at that point looks right at me and she asked, "Do you have a funeral plan?" Well, okay, I wasn't expecting that, and it took me a minute to answer. I said, well, nothing formal. I do know the funeral home that I'll use, and as a life cycle celebrant, I know the kind of service that I want for Dick. I have a dear friend and colleague that I would ask to perform the service. I know Dick wants to be buried, not cremated, and I already have a collection of photos, and I've started a playlist of music. I haven't drafted an obituary. I haven't made a list of people to call right away. Erin then said that based on her observations, the end might not come for a year, but it could be months, and it could be weeks. Weeks? That's crazy, and I told her so. Dick was still walking, still eating, feeding himself most of the time. Erin explained that things can change really fast with Alzheimer's. I remembered one of the neurology nurses who told me that, for one thing, a fall can cause a broken hip, and the resulting immobility can cause other problems, blood clots, depression, and of course the fall itself can prove fatal. Another thing is difficulty swallowing doesn't always mean choking, like the night at the wedding reception when Dick swallowed a piece of meat that should have been cut up into at least 3 other pieces. Difficulty swallowing can mean the muscles in the throat just don't remember what to do, and something, even a small something, even liquid, can wind up in the lungs. And the person with Alzheimer's just can't always cough it out, and then pneumonia follows, and pneumonia can be deadly. And then, poor sanitary habits in the bathroom can transfer E. coli bacteria from the hands to the face, the eyes, the mouth. Infection can spread easily and can be deadly. And then there are the UTIs, the urinary tract infections. They're not uncommon at all in the elderly. And because UTIs in the elderly aren't easily detected without a specimen, the infection can build up quickly. And then sepsis sets in. In severe sepsis, the patient's antibiotics, they stop trying to fight the infection and instead they turn on the body itself. Severe sepsis can cause organ damage and can be deadly. And I thought, okay, I get the picture. The registered nurse, Erin, needed my signature on the do not resuscitate, do not intubate form. I picked up my pen and signed my name. My hand held steady. Inside I restrained an earthquake. A second nurse, Togor, an LPN, came on Friday, June 3rd, just to check up on Dick. She asked if I'd be willing to see a chaplain, a non-denominational woman who's not so much a religious person but a spiritual person. Togor thought it would be a good idea for me to talk with her, and I said sure. In contrast to my usual posture about such things, I'm open to receiving help. I know without reservation that I can't take care of my husband and myself alone. Now, Dick had been particularly restless that day, hopping up and down from his recliner, pacing, walking out to the front door several times. Pamela, the CNA who's helping me 2 mornings a week, she kept up with him just fine. With all the construction going on here repairing the foundations, it's just not safe for Dick to be outside, even with someone. He had fall number 7 later that day, a simple collapse against a chair. He didn't wind up on the floor. 3 days later, June 6th, he's sitting at the kitchen looking out the window at the meadow. He was noticeably calm and quiet. He talked about all the children playing outside. There were no children. There were no people of any age in the meadow. He pointed to where he saw his parents. They've been dead for more than 40 years. I walked over and I gave him a bowl of yogurt and granola. He looked right into my eyes and said simply and serenely, "I'm leaving now." I mirrored his tone and said simply, "Okay, I understand. It'll be okay." The next day, June 7th, we had an in-person appointment with a neurologist. I asked my friend and neighbor Helen to come with me. She has a grown son who is nonverbal and has special needs, and she's also familiar with medical equipment. We put the transport chair in the back of my Forester, and then came the 10-minute battle of getting Dick into the car. Finally, he sat comfortably in the back seat with his seatbelt fastened. I can't let him sit in the front seat anymore, because more than once he has reached out to grab the steering wheel while I'm driving. Anyway, our appointment was at 3:05. We pulled into the parking lot and into a handicap spot at 2:40. Plenty of time to get into the building. Wrong. Helen and I got out of the car and we took out the transport chair. And then we kept trying to get Dick to get out of the car and sit on the chair. 20 minutes later, I called the receptionist and I told her what was going on. She sent 2 aides with another wheelchair, and they couldn't get him to sit down either. So these 2 aides got on either side of him and took his arms and walked him in. Helen and I followed, each of us pushing a chair. Understand now that Dick's blood pressure often runs low. That day, it was 84/58. I have a notebook that I take with me to all of his appointments so I can jot these details down. The neurologist and the nurse asked some questions, made observations, and took some notes of their own. These in-person appointments let the medical professionals observe Dick for themselves, and they can assess his decline more accurately. We talked about the DNR-DNI form that I had signed in the presence of Erin, the visiting nurse from the VNA. The neurologist asked if I understood the ramifications, that should Dick experience an event that caused his heart to stop, he would not be resuscitated, and that should he reach the point where he could no longer eat, he would not be fed through a tube down his throat. I said that at that stage that my husband is in, I think resuscitation or intubation would be cruel. Both the neurologist and the nurse practitioner agreed with me. And then I repeated what Erin, the visiting nurse, had told me, that my husband could stay like this for a year, but that death could come in a few months, even a few weeks. And the neurologist exchanged a look with the nurse and then turned to me and said, "We agree." The neurologist said that she would proceed to order the official DNR-DNI bracelet that Dick would need to wear. We also agreed that future appointments should be virtual. The ordeal of getting my husband into the office was stressful on all of us, especially on Dick. And, well, the neurologist saw what she needed to see. The two aides helped me get Dick back to the car, and my neighbor Helen helped me get him buckled in. We drove home without any incident, thank goodness. Lisa, the social worker with the visiting nurses, came the next day. We talked about scheduling an aide to come twice a week to help Dick shave and get a shower. We talked about how things might look in the near future. And we talked about converting the dining room into a bedroom so that my husband could live on one floor and not have to take those stairs. We talked about ways to block the stairs. The next morning, Friday, June 10th, the CNA, Pamela, and the visiting nurse, Togor, were both here when Dick's legs turned to spaghetti, and he just collapsed. That was number 8. Now, they caught him on his way down, each bracing under an arm, and while walking with him to the chair, Pamela commented that this behavior was a first, and I had to clarify, no, the sudden loss of connection to his legs has been, well, it's been going on since last summer. It happened a lot during the 5 months that we lived with our daughter and her family in Rhode Island. But it was the first time Pamela had seen it. The behavior usually happened in the late afternoon and evening. This was the first time it happened so early in the day. That evening, Dick got tired early. I gave him his meds and put him to bed around 6:30. It was a beautiful, warm evening. I had all the windows open, and Dick fell asleep instantly. I knew that several of my neighbors had gathered on the deck next door. Several of them were living elsewhere while the crumbling foundations of their buildings were being replaced, just as my building was last year. I hadn't seen some of these neighbors in a long time, and I walked over to the neighboring deck to say hello. Being with my neighbors, telling stories, laughing, nibbling on cheese, sipping a little wine, it restored my spirit, and I stayed for about 30 minutes, far longer than I intended. I might have stayed even longer, but I heard my husband scream. In fact, everyone on the deck heard it. The heavy thud came first, and then the agonizing screams for help. I raced home up onto my own deck through the back door into the kitchen, but there were no signs of him. I went through the dining room, the living room, and he wasn't there either. I turned to go up the stairs, and that's when I saw him. And I think my heart could have stopped. He was on the landing at the top of the wooden stairs, lying on his back, his head, his neck, and his shoulders hanging, like dangling down over the first 2 steps. He was clinging with one hand to the corner of a wall. One false move and he would slide down head first. That was fall number 9. I ran up the steps. I laid face down on the stairs and ducked my head, neck, and shoulders underneath him, lifting him enough to take the pressure off. And now neither of us could move. And just like in a superhero movie, the 3 men who had been sitting on my neighbor's deck with their significant others appeared right behind me. I knew Rick and Vic. The third man, Paul, I had met just that night, and I didn't know it then, but Paul had a considerable experience in this area. He supported Dick so that I could get up, and then he directed the other 2 men into position. Paul asked if I had a transfer belt. I did. I kept what looked like a long canvas seatbelt with a buckle all coiled up beside the bed, so I grabbed it and I gave it to Paul. My daughter had convinced me to purchase that belt a year or 2 ago. I had never used it. In fact, I'd never even seen it used, and I can't tell you how Paul did it. But in less than a minute, he had that belt around my husband's waist, and as Paul pulled on the belt from the front, facing Dick, the other 2 men lifted my husband from behind. Quickly, calmly and so compassionately. The 3 men helped my husband into bed, and then they left. And Dick went right to sleep. I took a minute to settle my own nerves, and then I called the visiting nurses. They had instructed me to call whenever there was a change in behavior, and certainly to call if he fell again. The operator on the 24/7 line said that the nurse on call, Linda, would get in touch with me. And a few minutes later, Linda called. I explained what happened, and she said she'd be over shortly to check him out. I went downstairs and unlocked the front door, and then I went out back onto my deck. My neighbors were still on Carol's deck next door. I just told them that I had called the on-call nurse and that she was coming over shortly to make sure that Dick was okay. I thanked them all again, and then I went inside and I locked the back door and went upstairs. And there was my husband, standing in the doorway between our bedroom and the top of the stairs. "Help me," he said. I saw the fear in his eyes. I saw the trembling in his legs, and I knew that any moment now they were going to turn to spaghetti. I scooped him under the arms, and as I did, he collapsed against me. I fell back against a bookcase. There was no way I could hold him up. Unlike the other times, I didn't want to ease him to the floor. We were too close to the stairs. That's fall number 10. Fortunately, the bedroom windows were wide open, and the deck was right beneath. I screamed for help, and I heard Vic shouting, "We're coming, we're coming." And that's when I remembered that I had locked the back door. But a few minutes later, I heard the front door open. I heard the men come up the stairs. Paul stood behind Dick, held him at the waist, promising not to let Dick fall. And meanwhile, Vic and Rick pried Dick's fingers off my arms. Only then did I release my grip on Dick's shoulders. Once again, these men helped Dick get into bed, and as I followed them downstairs, I heard voices. A lot of voices. All the people who had been on Carol's deck were now in my living room. I looked to her for an explanation, and she just smiled and said, "We're not going anywhere until the nurse gets here." I had no words for how grateful I felt. And then when Mark and Angel came home, because they'd been out, they joined us. Angel is the man, I told you Dick thinks is his younger brother, Albie. Mark then stayed outside to flag down the nurse. The nurse, Linda, came. She checked my husband's vital signs, and they were okay. She checked for cuts, for broken bones, for any signs of a concussion. There was nothing. She said I could give him the other half of the sleeping pill that I give him every night. And I did. Linda, the nurse, went home. My neighbors all went home. I went to the kitchen to make sure I had put everything away. And that's where I was when I heard Dick scream. I ran up the stairs again, and he was lying, this time on his back, on the floor of the bathroom that's right at the top of the stairs. Fall number 11. I had my phone in my pocket, and I called Mark and Angel, and they came right over, helped me get Dick up and back into bed. And of course, they'd also had a very long day, and they went right home. About 10 minutes later, Dick got up from bed, stood right next to the bed, and urinated all over the floor. He was agitated, highly agitated. I simply couldn't control him. He did get himself into bed, but it was on top of a big soaking pad, a wet soaking pad. So I grabbed Murphy's oil soap, laundry soap, a roll of paper towels, and I worked as fast as I could to at least control the worst of it. And then I grabbed my phone and I hit redial. Mark and Angel came right back. I couldn't let Dick sleep on a wet pad, and I couldn't move him by myself. Plus, I didn't want the bedding or the mattress to get wet. And yes, I've got a big waterproof pad on the mattress, but all kinds of things can happen. Anyway, by this time, Dick was seriously restless. The men managed to turn him on his side, just enough for me to pull the soaking pad from beneath his body, and stroke of luck, the sheets were all still dry. Then I pulled a brand new pad from the dresser drawer, and instead of placing it to hold the length of my husband's body, we positioned it horizontally so it could act like a sling and make it easier, with two people anyway, to pull him into position. Now, understand, I needed Dick to sleep on his side of the bed because that's where the safety rail is. It's the only thing that keeps him from falling off the side, something he's done several times in the past. Otherwise, if he was comfortable where he was, I could have worked around it. But Dick wanted nothing to do with being rolled over again. Fortunately, Mark and Angel were able to talk to him in a way that calmed him down, and we got him into position. And when my neighbors went back home again, I steamed the floor where Dick had urinated, and I tried again to wash the dust ruffle. By this point, I was exhausted. I was depleted in every way, and I was overwhelmingly grateful. That night could have ended so much worse. Dick woke up at 4:05 a.m. I held his hands and walked him into the bathroom. He urinated into the toilet with minimal misses, and he went right back to bed. The scope and the volume of changes in my husband's health increased noticeably in May. You need to know what that kind of decline could look like. Not that it necessarily will, because Alzheimer's patients are all different, because people are all different. I'll tell you more of what happened on the next episode because, unfortunately, it wasn't over. There were more falls. There was another trip to the ER. One experience was particularly difficult. And after that one, I heard one ER nurse warn another nurse, "Watch out for him. He's a fighter." And I had more tough decisions to make. But that's for the next episode. In the meantime, if you know a family caregiver for someone with dementia, if you know a caregiver whose spouse has dementia, if you know friends and family of dementia caregivers, please tell them about the podcast. Oh, and someone you wish knew what you're going through, tell them about the podcast too. The easiest way to listen is to just go to the website, myspouseHasDementia.com, because once you're there, if you decide to subscribe, and I hope you do, you'll find buttons for Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Amazon Music, and, old-fashioned RSS feed. If you've gotten this far in this long episode, thank you for sticking with me. My scratchy voice is the result of a common head cold. I haven't had one in years. Caring for someone is exhausting. And when that someone is someone you love, it's a whole different kind of exhaustion. It takes its toll. And you do need to be prepared for that. Finally, when I say take good care of yourself, those words aren't fluffy. They're fierce because we need to survive.